Well, welcome to another episode of the Business's Mission podcast. I am here with kind of old new friend. I'm not sure which, Scott Ross. Scott is the executive director of an agency called 5 and 2 Global Initiatives, and he is also the regional catalyst. Is a term he gave me. I like that. I decided I think I may adopt that for myself for BAM Global America Latina, meaning he is leading up the BAM Global work in Latin America, and not just Latin America, but really among Spanish-speaking people all over the world. So, Scott, first of all, welcome to the show. Great to see you again.
Thanks, Mike. Yeah, I'm glad to be here.
So, Scott, that was a quick official introduction. But as I mentioned to you a moment ago, I want to start with just kind of who are you, and what are you doing now? What does your life look like? Your work, your ministry, your family. Give us a few minutes of who is Scott Ross and what's happening, and then we're gonna hear your story, kind of going back in time, and walk us through how God moved you from your construction background on into what you're doing now. The beauty of this for our listeners is that Scott has not ever ceased to be a business person. He was not a missionary turned business person. He's not a business person turned missionary. He is the perfect example of both at the same time. So Scott, tell us, I guess, first of all, just about you, your family, your work there, based in Peru, but the global work that you're involved in.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Mike. Again, so I am father, first a husband. It's my wife Julia. We've been married be 12 years in March. Coming up on 12 years. 2 children, both adopted here in Peru. Well, one, as you know, we're nearing the end of its legal process with. So I have my daughter Anya. She's 9, going to be 10 in February. My son Lucas, who just turned 5 in August, and he's the one we're working on getting legally finalized adoption for him. So we've lived here in Peru, my wife and I, almost our entire marriage. We moved to very shortly after getting married, and we currently kind of wear 2 hats. We have our nonprofit, our 5 and 2 Global Initiatives, and through them, then we kind of are giving some of our time to this development of the BAM Global Network for the region of Latin America, Caribbean. But as you said, it's in reality, since there's not that many outside of that region that are also Spanish speakers, we open our doors to anyone who speaks Spanish, wherever they may be. And so those 2 roles, primarily with 5 and 2, we are a capacity builder. We do a number of different trainings, anything from kind of planning and time management all the way through to some pretty intense, almost MBA level business startup courses. So in between, we also have finance and stewardship, and we also offer the foundations course that faith-driven entrepreneurs put together. And then on the network side, I've been part of developing the network and kind of working with a few other Latinos to develop it here for a few years now. We're in that we organize 2 events a month, and now we're doing our first ever conference, which I'm sure we'll talk more about. And that whole thing is basically to just help Latinos, especially, get connected with what is the BAM Global movement. As you and I have talked about, Latinos our Spanish speakers have a specific disadvantage in a lot of that. In the English language is such a barrier compared to most of the developed or developing world, even. And so that's been a big part of what we're trying to do, is get things available to them in Spanish, do things that are BAM Global type events or with BAM Global people, but that are Spanish speakers, and just really expose them to that movement, and let them see, again, things we talked about, that idea of there are others doing this.
Yeah.
And that's been an amazing encouragement to me all along from the beginning. Is as we were just a few, even those were the first comments we always heard. Wow, there are other people who think like this, and we continue to hear that even now that we're, a few hundred people in this network. It's the same comment over and over again. And I think it rings true for any of us who've been involved in this for however long, honestly.
Yeah, it is true. And when I think about, as I mentioned to you, or you knew this, of course, but I learned it statistically. I knew it was a big number, but Spanish is the fourth largest language group on the planet. And so it certainly makes sense strategically as well as personally to make sure that we're offering not just BAM stuff, but all kinds of theological and discipleship, everything we're doing. The church needs to think about the Latin community and the Spanish
Absolutely.
speaking community. And when you look at the numbers, I mean, it's English, Chinese, Hindi, and Spanish. And the thing about, Spanish language is it crosses so many international borders. I mean, it's
Yeah.
so many different countries, so many different nations, parts of the world impacted. So, to our listeners, if any of you happen to be an author, let me ask you to consider publishing some of your work in Spanish. If you're a teacher, same thing. I mean, we need to respond to that. And Scott is on the front line of doing it. And when he talks about a network of a few hundred, of course, that's representative of hundreds of millions of people that can be impacted by this. I love that you're doing it. Scott, one other thing real quickly, because you mentioned it, and I want to ask our listeners, just, stop right now and say a prayer for Scott and Lucas, their son. Um, he shared with you the other day, and I don't want to get all personal with you, Scott, but you were pretty open about it. The hassle is the best way to put it. Sort of it's not like, is it legal or not legal, or is there anything shady? It's just the sheer bureaucratic hassle of getting this adoption finalized for their family. So pray for Scott and Lucas and his wife and their daughter, that the family could be made legally whole. Guys, if you're listening, just stop, and say a quick prayer for their family.
Yeah.
I know they'd appreciate that.
Yeah, I appreciate that a lot, Mike.
So
I
Scott,
just want to mention too real quick about what you were just talking about, because I think it is so important, because I think a lot of people don't realize I'm not trying to offend the church, but the reality of the neglect, I don't know a better word to use, of the Spanish speaking world. And I think what you're talking about is so true. Again, I'm not trying to get off on a big tangent, but just quick.
go, man. This is your podcast.
But I think that we're talking about, like you said, a huge population. But not only that, there's been a huge focus, and I'm not saying we shouldn't be focused on China and Hindu-speaking places, but they're a lot harder to reach and a lot more close to the gospel often as well.
Mhm.
And here in Latin America and in Spanish-speaking America, the majority of them are coming from a Catholicized, background where they're very open to the Bible, honestly.
Yeah.
And so I think as an evangelical church, there's a huge opportunity that's been missed for years to really reach people. And I had no idea until I lived here, the amount of which published materials, resources in Spanish just didn't exist, honestly, until I was here.
I could testify to that too, Scott. I've been working in Latin America now for probably 12, 13 years, starting in Brazil, which people don't think of as Latin America, but it is. It's a huge country.
Yeah.
Not Spanish speaking, of course, but it is Latin America. But now all over the Spanish speaking part of Latin America as well. And I just concur with you. The openness, the hunger, the excitement in general for things evangelical, for things biblical, and particularly business's mission seems to be really taking root and spreading rapidly. It's a great hunger. There's a great, particularly among the younger people. To me, I mean, my age, everybody's younger, but the 20s and 30s are really just, they're eating this up. They're jumping in. They're starting businesses. So I'll echo you, echoing me. If you've got resources, listeners, and you have or a heart and interest in the Latin speaking or the Spanish speaking Latin American world, find a way to jump in. The water is great, and the people are wonderful. And I do believe with all my heart that God is on the move, very much on the move in Spanish speaking world right now.
Yeah. And we talked about too, just kind of maybe to wrap this part of it up. Like, there's also a huge ability of this people group, Spanish speaking world, to go into a lot of places easier. then a lot of us with U.S. passports and other
Yes.
developed country passports can go. So there's
Yep.
so much strategically that makes a lot of sense about it as well. Not to mention the cost of sending is significantly less as well for a lot of them. So there's
Absolutely.
just a lot of really, I think, amazing stuff that can come out of this region in the near future. And God is
So
working already in it.
absolutely. And I think it is strategic. It's not just opportunistic, it's strategic. So let me ask you, you mentioned quickly, and let's jump on it before we get to a little bit of how you got to where you are. You mentioned the conference. And
Yeah.
unfortunately, you invited me to be there and I've got a conflict, so I won't make it. But let's tell folks about the I guess this is the first uh, BAM Latina America or America Latina conference that you guys have ever put on. So tell us about that. When is it? How can they learn more about it?
Yeah. Yeah. We are going to have Jao Mordomo, who I know has been on your podcast before. He's going to be with us as the representing BAM Global. And we've got a number of other really just phenomenal Latino, Spanish speaking people coming. Some folks like Marari Bene, who is at La Sound and has got tremendous business. We've got people from Venezuela, Costa Rica, um, a Brazilian who now lives in Costa Rica, Ecuador. We've got people and a number of Peruvians as well. It'll be here in Peru, March 7th and 8th of 2025. We have a website, which I know you'll have in the show notes, which is Conferencia. Now I'm going to have to remember. Conferencia BAM LATAM. Conferencia BAM LATAM.com.
Yeah.
So if you're a Spanish speaker, you'll get that. If not, you can look in the show notes.
It'll be in the show notes. Absolutely. And I encourage you, if you get a chance to go, you really want to broaden your horizons in a BAM global perspective. Go to one of these conferences, not the big one. Go to one of these regional conferences. They're really powerful. And this would be a great one to go to. And if you're in the U.S., Peru is very easy to get to. It's a straight shot from virtually every major airport, straight into Lima, and you're there. So it's not a hard trip.
And you could just go over and see Machu Picchu while you're here. So
there you go. In fact, Scott will give you a personally guided tour.
If they want to pay my way, I'll happily guide their tour.
There you go. So Scott, let's go back in time. We got a picture of kind of who you are, and again, I really want people to not only think about going to the conference, but pray for it, consider sponsoring it. But if you can get there, go. These things are amazing. But
mention also, Mike, real quick.
You bet.
You can also attend virtually if you want, because we will be doing it in a virtual way. So if you can't,
excellent.
If you want to just participate that way, you can do that as well.
Oh, excellent.
So if you have a Spanish speaking community in your church in the United States that might benefit from it, they could happily connect and hear people in their native tongues talking about BAM.
My daughter goes to a Spanish church and a Spanish speaking church, my oldest daughter. And so I'll make sure I'll be with their pastor this coming week for Christmas. This is being recorded the week before Christmas in December. This probably won't come out until, February. But anyway, I'm going to mention to her and let him know about it as well. He's from Ecuador.
We got rates for different size groups. So if they wanted to do like a group gathering at their church, there's a specific.
Oh, like a group watch
for that. Yeah.
Awesome. All right, let's go back in history. Tell us a little bit of kind of your journey. And as I mentioned, before, we don't have to go back to I was born at a very early age, ran away with a circus, but I had to bring it back, that sort of stuff. But how did you get to where you are?
Yeah. Well, there's certainly been circus in my background, not a literal circus, but I think as any of us who've been involved in BAM, it's never a straight line. I don't think I've yet to talk to anybody who experience has been just like, and I followed that path and it was exactly as I thought it was going to be.
So a lot of zig, a lot of zag.
Yeah. I came on mission trips to Peru and I felt immediately like it wasn't for me. So that's not what anyone expects to hear, right? At this point, I came back from my first trip and I said, I don't think I'm ever going back to Peru. Literally, I just said, I'm going to keep doing business and I'll support missions, but I don't need to go. Um, only to then a few weeks later be approached by one of the elders who had led the team that year, who said, "I think you're the perfect person to lead this team next year." And so I had this conflict, right? I was like, I didn't even think I was going. And he's asking me to lead the team. I said, all right, well, I'll pray about it. But in my mind, I was like, that's not happening, you know. But the Lord just convinced me otherwise. That's the only way I can put it, because honestly, it was not my intention to ever return. Um, I had gone on my trip. I didn't dislike it, but I just didn't know that, it felt like the best use of my time. I was looking at it purely as a business person. And I was like, I can make more money in the United States to support more people doing what I'm doing. Why do I need to go? You know what I mean? And like that, it was just a calculation in my mind at that point still.
Yeah.
And it wasn't that I didn't value mission. I did. I was just looking at it from a purely numbers crunching aspect in my head,
That's a
Um,
fairly consistent rationalization.
yeah,
You're certainly not the only one that's ever gone through that process of thinking, I'll make my money here and I'll be generous and that'll be great. And that's fine. There's nothing for those that God calls to that. That's exactly what they should do. But God somehow says, no, that's not what I'm asking you to do.
I completely agree with you. And I think we need lots of those people. And I think what I'm hoping to do now, what I feel like the Lord has kind of brought me here to do, which we'll get to through this whole thing, is, you know, help people here build that mentality, right?
Yeah.
I'm going to do my business and I'm going to be the one who supports ministry and mission, because the Lord has blessed me. And that was the mentality. I was clearly in that. And I thought, but the Lord convinced me otherwise. And then the moment he didn't say, go be a missionary, he just said, yeah, you could lead this trip. Because I clearly, in my entrepreneurial and business background, I have leadership skills, and that wasn't,
Yeah.
it was noted so I said, okay, yeah, I can do that. I think the Lord is telling me I should do that. So I did for a few years. And after a few of those trips, I came to the conclusion after the third or fourth time leading that the Lord was telling me I was actually supposed to go and be a missionary.
Hmm.
And now is when it got really confusing, because I was like, okay, now I don't understand, because it was one thing to say I can sacrifice a couple of weeks and go away. And now I had just started a second business. And I was like, I don't understand what you're doing to me, God. This doesn't seem like at all the path I thought I was going on. Right. But in the next few years, there were a lot of life events that happened. I had lost my little brother in a car accident right after that happened. And that again threw me for a wrench. And I think all of these things were just the Lord preparing me for like being more dependent on him, especially I think, as men and as entrepreneurs, if we've had any success at all, we can get a little bit, kind of dependent on ourselves, you know? And so I think that through this period of time, it was him just kind of showing me, you know, you don't have to depend on yourself. Yes, do good things and do all that you can do with your own abilities, but you don't have to depend on yourself, you know?
Yeah.
Um, and so in preparation to come to the field, because I can tell you, if you come onto the field thinking that you're the one who's going to make anything happen, you're going to leave very disappointed, you know?
Yeah.
What we can accomplish it. And I think most of us go on the field with higher expectations than we probably should. And there's not time for me to get into that whole probably this concept and thought, but um, again, as a business person, I think we can put just high expectations on anything that we expect to accomplish. Because we have to play it. But anyone who's been on the field can tell you that life does not follow our plans on the field at all. People take a long time to come around to you. Relationships are not
Mm.
things that happen overnight. And if people don't trust you and you don't have, relationships that really matter, it's very hard to make inroads in these places as a foreigner.
Yeah.
And it's understandable. Now that I've lived here so long, I look back on it and I go, of course they don't trust me. I mean, look at their recent history. They literally were, invaded by a foreign country, and those people, took over everything multiple times, and then they forced a twisted version of their own religion all out just to control them more, you know, and everything was taken from them. And they continue to have a lot of their resources and other things taken from them by foreign entities, you know, in a manipulative way. You know, I'm not trying to get political or anything. I'm just talking
No,
about
it's true. It's
what
history.
happens in most of these places, you know. And so why would they look at me and say, oh yeah, that guy's here to help me? It's going to take them a while to come around to that conclusion, you know?
Yeah.
I have to demonstrate over and over again that genuinely that's what I'm here for, you know? So anyways, that's a long version of another part of it. But I got to this point then where I was like, okay, so I am going on to go become a missionary. I don't really think I'm a pastor. Like, is that really what I'm supposed to do? You know? And at this point, this was 2005 and 6, 7, right around there. So, you know, you've been in this, you know, world a long time. There was very little publicity around resources.
Yeah.
You know, the internet wasn't quite what it is now anyways. It was still much, you know, it still existed, obviously, but it wasn't like full of, you know, searches you could find on BAM stuff. There just wasn't much out there.
We refer to it as the Wild Wild West in the West.
Yeah. And like, if you don't know what business as mission or BAM is, you don't know how to even look for it, right? It's like, because it hadn't been like named a thing. It was just starting to happen in the place. I mean, it had been happening always, obviously, but in a formalized, organized, named kind of movement, there just wasn't anything behind it. And so I just didn't know. So I started taking some seminary classes and trying to figure it all out. And then I think for me, I ended up at the Global Missions Conference for the PCA. That was the denomination that I came from to here, out of the PCA church in Virginia, and sat in on a session that the Chalmers Center was doing with Dr. Brian Fickert, and started hearing a lot of what he was talking about. And I was like, okay, that is right up my alley. That's the sort of stuff that gets me excited, you know? And then out of that, I started understanding and finding more things about this whole concept. And I was like, yeah, that's what I'm supposed to do. I'm not supposed to be a pastor. Now, I love my pastor at the time. He's a dear, dear brother. God rest his soul. He just passed away last February. But he didn't have any idea about what business was either, because it was new, you know? And so he had a lot of hesitation. He was not with me going to become a missionary, but he was just like, it wasn't something he understood, you know?
Yeah.
And
very common story, by the way. Very common.
Yeah. And in his mind, like, if you're a PCA member, you join the MTW, which is their, you know, international sending organization, and you go and you do something that MTW does. Well, at that point, the MTW literally had just put a director of business as missions in place near the end of when I started to figure this all out. But he was like one guy for the entire world. Yeah. And they wanted me to come to Peru to work under a pastor here in Peru who I knew. I had attended his church off and on whenever I was in Lima. And I knew him very well. We had talked about it. And I knew that it wasn't what he wanted. Like, it didn't make sense for him because he's a pastor who's like trying to train leaders and pastors and shepherd a church, right? And he didn't understand business. And so there was just all this. It was like you understand, and many people have sure had this experience. It was not an easy thing to do. But because I'm an entrepreneur, my idea was like, okay, well, I'll do my own thing, right? If you don't find someone who's doing it the way that it makes sense, like, I didn't want to do my own thing because I knew this was going to be hard. But at the same time, I said, no one's doing this in the way that I think the Lord wants me to do it, you know? And I didn't want to come here and be a burden on this pastor in Lima. Like, to me, that didn't make sense. Like I said, it's clearly, I talked to him multiple times about it, and it just was very evident to me that he did not want to really have me do that. And so Yeah, I started meeting with some other business people who I knew were also passionate about missions. And we met kind of monthly, bi-monthly, quarterly, depending on everybody's availability for a couple of years. And eventually we formed an organization and we created what is now our, our nonprofit side into global initiatives. And it just sort of came out with the, this vision that we wanted ministry to be expanded and supported through locals, and by locals, like in their country by them. Like, and how could we come alongside that? The way we've done that has I also followed this winding path over the years. I told you where we ended up. In the beginning, we started a coffee shop in the mountains to support an orphanage. And the Lord kind of closed the door on that project, and it's been through a number of different kind of versions along the way, but they've all always had that same vision of seeing God's kingdom expand and to see that expansion happen through the support of locals, especially local business people.
Mhm.
And so that's where we've ended up becoming this kind of catalyst built our capacity building organization to kind of raise up business people who understand that responsibility, and also improving their own, kind of lot in life as a result of this capacity building. So, yeah.
This is interesting of course, I could I could point out, I guess, what seemed to me to be key things you just shared. I mean, obviously, it, it in the beginning, you didn't have a box to put it in. You know, God showed you the box to put it in. You went typical sort of experience of thinking, wow, and they're all going to be really, and they are friendly. Don't misunderstand us. But there's a difference between friendliness and deep relationship. That's another, to me, key
Absolutely.
point. Is we go down with a typical American view of everybody's going to like me, and they do. They're pretty nice folks,
Yeah.
but they're not going to be close to you till they really test you. So that's hard. And then
Yeah.
finding that not only does the mission community at home not really get it, but the mission community there where you're going, they don't get it either. You're like,
Yeah.
wow, leper, what's going on with me, right?
Yeah.
But I love the fact, and you and I talked about this in a conversation, I guess, last week or week before. You described yourself as a person who perseveres, and that really is the story here, right? I mean, you got into it, and it wasn't easy, and it wasn't like the world's worst experience. It wasn't like you went home every night and cried to your pillow, but you had to persevere, or it would not have happened. And we know that's the grace of God, but that's critical. And now, just as you were talking about it, I want to throw this to you because we're kind of getting closer up to like present time. Uh, but you mentioned, really penetrating the community through business leaders. And that's such an important thing for people to think about, for our listeners to think about, and the agencies and the businesses they represent. Uh, you know, this so Latin America is not America in the 1950s, where everybody dresses up and goes to church on Sunday. It's the same dynamic of folks aren't going to church anymore. Believers go, but unbelievers don't go on a Sunday typically, because it's not the cultural norm. And with a Catholic background, they might go on special holidays. Some will go more regularly, but it's not this fertile preach the gospel at church kind of time period. But it is, to me, the great white field white for harvest is the business community. That's where the people are. You either have a business or you work in a business. I mean, there's not a lot of
Yeah.
alternative. And so where are you going to go? You're going to go where they are. And I love that you've done that. And now you're building networks and leadership and training. I mean, as you began in the start of the podcast, you're doing an amazing number of things. And I don't know how you do it. Those of you listening on the podcast, if you're watching this on YouTube, you'll get to see this glorious backyard that I'm seeing over Scott's shoulder. It's like, okay, doesn't look so tough, but it is tough. But you're building something that's really multidimensional. Now, we'll start wrapping up. I want to kind of get into your future just a little bit. You mentioned to me that you're thinking about another transition obviously when the adoption of Lucas is complete and you're free to travel and all that goes with that. But you're thinking of a transition. Tell us a little bit about that, and how at least you anticipate staying connected to this community that you built, because you are that catalyst. I tease you about your name, regional catalyst but you are that. And so what will happen when the catalyst is a few thousand miles away?
Sure. Yeah. So yeah, we didn't talk a lot about where we got to and how we're doing this stuff with BAM, but the short version of the build up, and then I'll answer your question quickly, is, a few years ago, as my experience through all of that had kind of gotten us in connection with BAM Global, um, we basically were participating in I think the first virtual one they did, the first virtual conference that BAM Global did, I think it was 2020. And um, they were going to have these network tables that were going to meet virtually. And Joe Plummer, who's one of the kind of co-leaders of that movement, sent out an email and said, if anybody is interested in having another table added for something that's not mentioned, let us know and we'll consider it. And so I just responded because there was nothing related to Latin America or Spanish speaking at all. And I said, could we possibly have a table for Spanish speakers, especially like Latin America? And she said, yeah, if you're willing to host it, I'm happy to have you, have a room for you guys. And so we did open that room, and I think there was like 12 to 14 people that got connected. And out of that group, we kind of decided we'd all share, whoever wanted to, our phone numbers, and we created a little WhatsApp group. And now here we are 4 years later, and we've got, I think, close to 300 people in that WhatsApp group. A number of others are connected in different ways. So yeah, that's been kind of where I think we talked about. I feel like the Lord long term in this transition is going to be kind of helping me continue to be a bridge for that network.
Mm-hmm.
As you said, the kind of catalyst word, I think is a part of that as well. One of the things that I've been doing in this network is helping institutions that exist, organizations like Faith Driven, for example, Faith Driven Entrepreneur. They have their foundations course. They had it all developed in a participant guide for Spanish, but there was no facilitator guide for Spanish. And they weren't seeing a lot of expansion in the amount of courses that were being offered. I took the course as a participant and then was going to try to lead it. And when I went in, it was all only in English. I reached out to them and said, hey, I think I might have figured out why you're not having, quite the expansion, because they're having huge success with this multiplication effect all over the country, all over the world in English speaking, places. But that wasn't working here. And so I simply just helped them translate the facilitator guide to Spanish. Got some other Latinos to help me review to make sure my translation was good, and a few other documents that they had and some other things just to create some of the publicity because they give you tons of great resources in English, but none of that was in Spanish.
Yeah.
And so we just kind of helped create all those other pieces that they already were doing for facilitators in English. And now we are starting to see, this expansion happening rapidly in Latin America. And the similar type thing I'm working with a couple of organizations doing similar things. And that's really where I see long-term, kind of the Lord leading me, is to kind of be that we talked about when we were talking about neglect, and this the struggles of the lack of English in Latin America, even among very well educated and high level business people.
Mm-hmm.
When you go to most of the rest of the world, when you get to a pretty high level business person, executive level, even just employee, the majority of them do speak enough English to get by, Yeah, it's just not the case in most of Latin America, honestly. There are certain business and certain sectors that are a little more particular about that. But the majority, I shared with you when we were chatting the other day, I have a friend and a brother from my church who has a very successful business. I'm not going to get into too many details because I don't want to embarrass him, but very successful business. And, he just doesn't really speak English at all. And I'm talking significant success, like very, very big business. But his English is very minimal and not enough to read and write for sure. And so if I want that person to engage with, some eh, other part of the business's missions ecosystem that exists, and they don't have things in Spanish,
Yeah.
they can't. And that is a hindrance on this ecosystem continuing to develop. And so that's really where I feel like the Lord has put me in this place due to my connections and my, ability to speak Spanish and English well. I feel like that's where he's leading me over this, as we look at a transition. We're not sure exactly what it's going to look like, the timing of it, but eventually, yes, we hope um, to move back to the United States. We're praying that very soon Lucas's stuff will get sorted. I imagine that we would, then sometime next year, Lord willing, go at least for a period of time and see whether it's for good or not. We're just going to see what happens and how the Lord leads going forward. My hope is that maybe we could be there all of next summer and then see what happens from there. But first we got to get this judge to sign off on this adoption, hopefully very soon.
Yeah. We're praying to that end, and many of these listeners are already praying for that. But you see how that all connects. And so, Scott, you and I could go on forever. We did this the other day. We got to talking and we were laughing, and you're an easy guy to talk with, and you got a great story, and I enjoy you, and I'm really glad we finally got connected. We should have. It's funny we didn't bump each other before now, but we finally did. And I'm really glad for that. Your story's a great one. I know it's an encouragement to everybody. Guys, all of the stuff will be in the show notes, all the contacts, the websites for various organizations. I do encourage our listeners, and maybe you are a Spanish speaking or a Portuguese speaking Latin American, or maybe you're in another part of the world as a Spanish speaker or a Portuguese speaker. Don't feel like you're alone. This is a movement that is really catching fire within the Latin community. Scott, you see it from your perspective. I see it from different places I go. I'm very excited. My my handicap is I've discovered that the secret to learning languages has to do with your ability to hear. And I have very, very bad hearing, and therefore I can read and write Spanish, but I cannot speak it to save my life. And so I'm not giving up. I've been at it for 12 years. So you're a persevering guy. So am I. But I'm doing it because I believe something special is happening in the Latin community. And I'm just thrilled to death you're there. Any parting words, advice, encouragement to our listeners? These are folks literally all over the world. We're in 132 different countries. So you've got a global audience, and this is your chance to give them a piece of your mind, brother. Give them a piece of your mind.
Well, one thing I'll mention real quick, and then I'll give you some parting words thing too. I think you and I talked about, and I want to plug this real quick. If you are a Spanish speaker and you want to do something like this and interview people who are doing BAM things in Spanish, let Mike or I know. Because we would love to try to put something like this together in Spanish, hosted by a Latino Spanish speaker, interviewing people in Spanish. So let us know.
Yeah, absolutely. And you will have all the contact information. Scott and I did talk about this, and this is not two Americans hosting a Latin Spanish speaking podcast. This is a Spanish speaker, a native Spanish speaker. Would be your podcast or your team's podcast. We'll teach you how to do it. We'll help you with the technology if you need that. We'll coach you, but this is another way of getting the word out. So yeah, thanks for bringing it. I'd forgotten that, and I'm glad you brought that back up. Hadn't forgotten it in the big picture, but just for today.
Sure.
So yeah, let us know if you're interested, and we will be more than happy to work with you to help make that happen.
And then I think the final words I would just say, the thing that I've always felt focused on in missions is that wherever we are, whatever we're doing, is mission. I think so often we want to put certain things on a pedestal, And that's not the way God intends it. I know very few pastors want it to be that way either, but I think we end up looking at it and saying, oh, he's a pastor. Yeah, there is certainly a level of respect and honor that we need to give to people who God has called to be pastors. The Bible is clear about that. But it doesn't make their role something unique or highly special in compared to what we have to do every day. Yes, they have a very unique and special calling that's theirs, but ours is equally important.
Yes.
It's just, and I think that's been the problem for so long, is that we've got this this sacred secular divide that's happened, and we talk about it all the time, but often we just don't actually take it to heart. And I think that when we do, we start to see big changes happen in our lives, because if we really do think about, is what I'm doing every Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, maybe half the day on Sunday.
A true entrepreneur spoke of that.
But I'm just talking about our regular life, not even just our work, but even just our regular life, but also our work is included in that, right? Is it really, because I think it's easy for us to take that few hours in the morning and say, I'm going to separate those for God, no matter what we're doing. But it's hard, genuinely hard, to say, I'm going to live every day, and do that for God.
Yeah.
All day. It's hard, Yesterday we went and helped at an event at our church. We're wrapping presents for, over 1,000 in total presents. And yesterday, 800 of them still needed wrapped, right? So we had a number of us go, and we're wrapping paper, and we come home and my wife is saying, oh, my back hurts. And I say, yeah, my knees hurt. We're on this like hard concrete floor, wrapping presents. It's not easy, but you know what? My children were there with me, and they're learning how do we serve, and tons of kids are going to be blessed by those presents. But it's a choice we make to give our time and go do those sort of events, and I think all of our life has those choices that happen throughout the day, whether it's in the office, out of the office, at an actual church, wherever it may be. And the easy choice is often not the one that glorifies God,
Yeah.
And I think you're talking about, that perseverance, have a 5-year-old son. Let me tell you, he doesn't want to do the things that glorify God most of the time. And what I hear all the time is, I want to do what I want to do. Yeah, so do I, That's what I keep telling him. So do I. But I know that that's not what God wants me to do a lot of the times. A lot of the times, my carnal self still wants to do things that God doesn't want me to do. And that's going to happen from year 5 until you're 95, 105, the Lord takes you home. But making those hard choices every day is, I think, what I would say we all need to be doing. Being willing to take that hard decision and keep doing it over and over again. Ooh, it's not easy.
Yeah. I love it. God, that's a great word for us to part on. I really appreciate you being with us. Let's have another conversation in the not too distant future and talk more about this multiplication of the podcast concept. It may be a more targeted conversation for a smaller audience, but just people that may have an interest in doing something like that, because it does reach people with the truth and encourages people. We've always concentrated on what we call drive time. We keep it 30, 45 minutes max. And that way, in the typical get in your car, you can listen to music, or you could pop in a podcast and listen to that. So let's talk more about that. Thank you, brother, for being with us. God bless you, man.
Thanks.